Hello, I am Nicholas Kosmatopoulos. I'm an assistant professor of politics and anthropology at the American University of Beirut. Today I will be presenting on blue holes, solidarity ships, and states of suspension at sea. This is work in progress, so I appreciate your critical and constructive feedback. Sovereignty, science, and the economy are currently leading a renewed drive to territorialize the seas. Extractionist regimes are expanding their jurisdictions. Remote sensing devices are chronicling the oceanic more than human as accessible resources. Mechanical, biological, and aquacultural advances are assembling into new foundations for corporate investment and state-sponsored blue growth. As a result, previously impossible territorializations are emerging along with new forms of capture and coding of maritime space. Taken together, there is clearly an ongoing great appropriation of the oceans that merits a critical response. Indeed, there is a rising interest in the sea by multiple academic disciplines and subfields. Critical scholars in the humanities and social sciences are building upon long and albeit largely marginalized traditions of inquiry on maritime issues of world-altering proportions, such as trade, militarization, migration, and environmental change. Parallel to these scholarly endeavors, a new radical politics at sea has risen. During the last decade, the Mediterranean Sea has witnessed the meteoric rise of terraqueous solidarities. These are grassroots movements that take to the sea to practice solidarity with those resisting or suffering from enclosures, state oppression, and humanitarian neglect. Solidarity ships, such as the ships to Gaza and the refugee rescue boats off the Italian and Greek coasts, are among those forces that counter and complicate the expansion of terraqueous sovereignties. Solidarity ships inadvertently carve out a novel political space that operates beyond state territoriality, but they also craft new political practices and alliances. In this paper, I present insights from decade-long ethnographic encounters with solidarity and protest movements at sea. I do so as an academic researcher, but also as a political activist and a member of Floats, a sea-oriented research collective that seeks to foreground radical action and research in at least two paths. First, by tracing where and by what material discursive means hegemonic powers reshape contemporary seas in the image of terrestrial territorializations. And second, by researching and participating in action-oriented projects which promote a democratic politics at sea. These projects often enhance the capacities of other, also emergent maritime worlds that are decidedly more hopeful, sustainable, and shared. Contemporary scholarship on expansion at sea manifests a fixation on flow. Thread-like metaphors such as supply chains, corridors, and choke points paint a global map of maritime interconnectedness. Trade, energy, and security must keep flowing. Sticking with spatial symbolism, thread imageries are complemented and complicated through representations of zoning. Take, for example, the exclusive economic zones or the extended risk zones of the Somali coast, which counter-piracy initiatives often map out for ships to be aware of. Zones are understood as areas of legitimate state expansion into the maritime domain in order to extract resources or protect routes. Still, my research on solidarity ships shows that the current reorganization of the maritime realm includes, along with forces of flow, spatial logics that seek to contain, block, and intercept. I contend that embargoes, blockades, containments, and sieges are also crucial elements of an emerging maritime order in the Mediterranean Sea and the world oceans. Inspired by the work of scholars in environmental humanities and feminism, such as Stacey Alaimo, Astrida Neymanis, and Michelle Murphy, I seek to explore how these spatial logics effectively impose a state of suspension on legality and knowability at sea. To conceptualize the phenomenon, I paraphrase the marine biological term blue holes to highlight the abrupt topical introduction of states of suspension at sea, which block the flow of knowledge and freeze applications of international law. Blue holes are the result of state and suprastate practices that impose total unknowability, exclude humanity from the zone of operations, and carve out spaces in which international law, information, and public debate are effectively suspended. In contrast to the offshore, blue hole is a temporary formation that erects a wall of state secrecy around it. In what follows, I discuss the emergence of blue holes in three cases: the Maritime International Solidarity Campaign to Gaza, the Maritime Protest against the hydrolysis of the Syrian chemical weapons, and the activist refugee rescue operations in the Mediterranean Sea. The Ships to Gaza are maritime campaigns of international solidarity to Palestine. They aim at actively challenge the embargo imposed by the State of Israel on the Gaza Strip since 2007, raise awareness among the global public, and deliver humanitarian aid to the population. The first ships of the campaign reached Gaza in August 2008. The so-called Gaza Freedom Flotilla in spring 2010 was the ninth attempt and by far the largest. Organizers were the US Free Gaza Movement, the Greek Ship to Gaza, the Swedish Ship to Gaza, the Turkish NGO EASA, and others. Initially, the fleet consisted of 8 ships, but only 6 sailed together on May 30th. 2 more ships, the Irish Rachel Corrie and the US Challenger 2, failed to join due to technical failures or possibly sabotage. The ships carried 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid, consisting of building materials required for the construction of houses, along with generators, prefabricated homes, drugs, medical equipment, school material, and more. Among the 700 participants were doctors, lawyers, journalists, trade unionists, artists, academics, and lawmakers from dozens of countries. Few hours later, the Israeli Navy violently attacked the ships, while the commandos confiscated all electronic devices, telephones, cameras, and films. The attack resulted in the killing of 9 and the arrest of 700 passengers, and the temporary incarceration of everyone on board in the prison of Beersheba. In prison, we were still in a blue hole, unable to communicate with anyone outside. At the same time, the Israeli state circulated its own version of the events that took place on board the Mavi Marmara. With all counter voices muted and all evidence confiscated, the state propaganda was able to construct a video that told one side of the story. In 2014, amidst the most ravaging days of the Syrian civil war, the UN Security Council backed a high-end deal between the governments of USA and Russia to destroy the Syrian government's arsenal of chemical weapons. The plan laid out by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or PCW, the world's chemical watchdog, was to destroy the chemical stockpile on board a US Navy ship in the international waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The toxic substances that can be used to create nerve gas agents such as sarin and VX were to be neutralized through a chemical reaction called hydrolysis, when chemical compounds decompose on contact with water. The governments of Italy and Malta expressed concern over the operation's environmental impact, but admittedly, mass mobilizations in the Greek island of Crete resembled a popular uprising against the operation. During the summer of 2014, in multiple gatherings and demonstrations, citizens, public officials such as Pavlos Polakis, the mayor of the city of Sfakia, scientists, as well as NGOs and environmental organizations, Greenpeace, Archipelagos, openly condemned the plant, branding it an environmental crime. They further questioned the safety of the operation and lamented the lack of official information being provided to coastal communities, scientists, and environmentalists. Quote, "The UN has given assurances that nothing will fall into the sea, but will they tell us where the residue will ultimately end up?" Quote ends. Greenpeace Greece Executive Director Nikos Haralambidis told AFP. The protest organizers invited the members of the ships to Gaza to participate in a maritime counter-operation. The aim was to locate the hydrolysis fleet in the middle of the sea and disturb the chemical operation. Thus, a June morning in 2014, I boarded the Agios Nikolaos, the traditional wooden fishing boat that broke the Gaza embargo in 2008. This time we were headed towards the West Mediterranean, and a yet undisclosed position where the hydrolysis was to take place. Yet, despite all efforts, which included consulting experts and other vehicles at sea and state officials, the chemical fleet could not be located on the map. Registered as a military operation, the fleet would not appear on marine vessel trackers either. A blue hole has just swallowed it, blocking all access to information about the exact location, the process, and the legality surrounding it. The current Black Lives Matter uprising in the US has reverberations on the refugee deaths in the Mediterranean Sea. Black and brown lives are currently lost when crossing the sea. The International Organization for Migration announced that in 2019, 1.3 thousand migrants died by crossing the central Mediterranean route. The Mediterranean Sea recorded worldwide the largest number of deaths and missing cases of people who migrated. The central Mediterranean Sea registered the highest number of fatalities. 2016 was the year in which the number of deaths on the central Mediterranean route peaked, with 4.6 thousand migrant deaths in the central Mediterranean Sea. Icarus, a crew member of the rescue boat Mediterranea, was interviewed on the Greek radio a few days ago. He claimed that public health measures in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic have become an integrated means for an aggressive EU anti-rescue policy at sea. Pushbacks by the EU and Frontex authorities are already well documented, but lately the purposeful disregard of distress calls by migrant boats is the rule. Here is what he told me over a phone call. People are drowning and no one is saving them. We headed for a boat in distress, but it was 120 miles away. So by the time we got there, 6 people had already died. They let people die of thirst, helpless in the middle of the Mediterranean. Rescue calls are deliberately ignored. Quote ends. In the context of refugee rescue, blue holes take the form of temporary formations of purposeful neglect of distress calls and the humanitarian law of the sea that obliges ships in the vicinity to assist boats in danger. A well-known case of a blue hole in the refugee rescue is the so-called left-to-die boat, thoroughly documented by the forensic oceanography, from whose report I quote here. The migrant deaths occurred in the context of the heightened concentration of coalition NATO assets in the area, enforcing a maritime embargo of Libya during the conflict after 2011. As Pezzani and Heller lament, this places these deaths squarely in the most highly surveyed area of sea in the entire world. Among the many vessels that attempted the journey, one particular boat was covered extensively in the international press. The case involves the journey of 72 sub-Saharan migrants fleeing Tripoli by boat on the morning of March 27, 2011. After traveling about halfway to the Italian island of Lampedusa, during their first day at sea, the vessel ran out of fuel and subsequently drifted for the following 14 days without food or water until landing back on the Libyan coast. Only 9 of the passengers ultimately survived. In interviews following the event, the survivors recounted a series of interactions they had with others while at sea. These included a military aircraft that flew over them, a distress call they placed via satellite phone, 2 encounters with a military helicopter and fishing vessels, and an encounter with a military ship. Moreover, the Italian and Maltese Maritime Rescue Coordination Centers, as well as NATO forces present in the area, were informed of the distress of the boat and of the location, and had the technical and logistical ability to assist it. Despite the legal obligation to render assistance to people in distress at sea enshrined in several international conventions, none of these actors intervened in a way that could have averted the tragic fate of the people on the boat. Conclusion. In her article on damped mustard gas in the Baltic Sea, Astrida Naimanis argues that in light of the refusal of the chemical events to be fully known, we must, I quote, somehow cultivate an ethics and politics of suspension, quote ends. Suspension is here understood as holding back definitive judgment, blame, and accountability vis-à-vis environmental or humanitarian neglect. Naimanis, following Alaimo, subscribes the suspension of accountability to a transcorporeal ontology of bodies, in which, quote, the material self cannot be disentangled from networks that are simultaneously economic, political, cultural, scientific, and substantial. Yet, in my research on emerging blue holes in the Mediterranean Sea, the state of suspension appears not as an ethical choice, but rather as imposed by state and suprastate actors. In these cases, the transcorporeal ontology of bodies might become a foundation for an ethics that promotes and pushes for the flow of accountability vis-à-vis environmental or humanitarian neglect. Bodies, legalities, technologies, and popular campaigns form a new politics of accountability at sea. These are often articulated through blue loopholes, namely crucial openings and critical observations that can challenge the states of suspension at sea. For example, a female body became a blue loophole aboard the Greek ship EASA, allowing the hidden footage to escape confiscation and making possible an alternative factuality. Forensic oceanography and activist rescue boats often rely on blue loopholes to present legal or humanitarian arguments to courts of law and the public. Critical scholarship is still our work, but perhaps thinking about it within the context of a rising politics at sea might allow it to escape the fate of being lost into a blue hole. Thank you for your attention.